Yes. As you may have heard, we've hit peak podcasts. There are now 700,000 podcasts with 2 to 3,000 new episodes coming out each month. If you don't know, podcasts are kind of like talk radio on demand. You can download and listen to them anywhere and wherever you like. I'm a big podcast. I've been listening to podcasts for years. Listening to podcasts about running, sports, news, data science, productivity, video games, and even podcasts about podcasts. Some of those are actually pretty good. There are a lot of really good, well-produced podcasts, such as the Serial podcast about the Adnan Syed trial is pretty popular and kind of kicked off this podcast boom. There's also some ones that aren't quite so good. I wanted to listen to a podcast about a video game. It was a guy who basically recorded him talking to himself while he drove into work about the video game. With no editing either. It just uploaded and that was it. So needless to say, that one wasn't especially good. But there's also, podcasts can make good companions. They can be there for you. There can be a friend for you, there for you when you do things, when your friends aren't there for you, like when you are cleaning toilets or mowing the lawn or commuting to work, unless you carpool. So what makes a good companion podcast is is something that's entertaining. You want to listen to it for a reason. Informative, educational. Isn't really a requirement, but it helps you feel like you actually are doing a little bit more with your time. And also, conversational in a way that you get to know the host personally, and I think that's the key part. And so, one of my favorite podcasts is this podcast Startup, and it's a podcast. Well, it's about startup companies. And the first season, the host Alex Bloomberg takes you on his journey of starting a podcast company, Gimlet Media. And so, through this experience, you get a behind-the-scenes look at what it's like to go through the process of startup, working with venture capitalists, getting money, figuring out what the business model is going to be, things like that. And the company ends up going on to be successful. That first season was turned into a sitcom, Alex Inc., starring Zach Braff. And Gimlet Media was recently bought by Spotify, and so now he's a millionaire, and kind of proof of the podcast boom. People are not only just easy to make, but they're getting rich off it. So why not? Everyone do it. But as a successful podcast company, they've made a number of other shows, and one of which is Reply All. And Guardian put it best. It's a podcast about the internet that is actually an unfailingly original exploration of modern life and how to survive it. So the hosts, PJ Vogt and Alex Goldblum, they'll kind of address different issues about technology, internet, and one of my favorite episodes, guy tracks down a robocaller. And so, let me read a little bit from the transcript. So Alex Goldman starts out, I got a phone call from a 1-800 number. And I don't know what it is about 1-800 numbers. My natural impulse is just to be curious as to who's calling me, so I always pick them up. The co-host goes on brief tangent, questioning this reaction, asks him if he also opens up junk mail as well. It kind of seems like a waste of time, but it turned into a pretty interesting 2-episode part for the podcast. And so for the robocall, it was a message saying that your iCloud account has been hacked and to immediately call this number to get it resolved. So he calls it back. And he ends up talking with the guy and have a long conversation. He calls him back a number of times. The guy who was trying to hack his computer ends up quitting the job. There's a company that he worked for that ran this phishing scheme. And they talk, and he ends up inviting him to come meet with him. So he travels halfway around the world and meets with this guy, goes and like finds out who the owner of the company is and talks to him, because he's really like, this does seem kind of crazy, like who wants to spend this much time going into a scammer, but it makes for a very interesting and compelling storyline. And he ends up talking to them and trying to like say, will you admit that you're trying to take advantage of people and scamming people out of their money? And the owner obviously never says he'll do that, but the whole point of it is, you know, we've gotten to the point where we're scared to pick up our phone and answer it if we don't know who it is. We don't know whether it's some scam or anything, and so he just wanted to turn the table, and so when they're calling someone, they don't know who's going to travel halfway across the world and start questioning them as to their motives. But it's stories like this and the rapport between the host, Alex Goldwyn and PJ Vogt, that makes it, and their openness, that you really get to know them. It makes for a great companion podcast. So next time you have some chores to do, look for a good companion podcast, something that's entertaining, educational, and conversational. And I think you'll enjoy it.